Okay, cool. math wasn't there. No. I think we're Jack and Tom Ross with the fraction. It's like when the block goes completely to one wheel. How do you do that? Yeah.
Was that a rock star?
Yeah.
But if you mean that is disgusting. So much sugar than those are like 275. Is it good?
I like it.
Oh gosh, that.
What's happening with me?
Yeah. Yeah, I had to take off. I just honestly.
Oh, your parents?
I just
She goes, why are you wearing that? I was like, this is what
Yeah.
you
Usually, my parents are the same. My parents are like really good. Yeah. Yeah, my new pencil bags are good for something.
Yeah, trouble in the long one, so it's like.
But hey, it's free. What flavor is it? What flavor?
Very good on it. How many layers do you have on right now? Oh, you wait for Ivan? Oh.
This. I saw that it was.
Hi, how's one pause?
No, you know what? It's not funny. I saw that.
Oh, were you talking to her?
Yeah.
Okay. That's why I was like, why are you looking all like that?
So it's very-
Oh, she doesn't like that. I got a what? Yeah, all my friends got A's. I think wait,
Yeah, something like this.
Yeah, so it's.
Or like, so we took an exam.
Yeah.
When you-
I think most of my errors were just like,
yeah, I just all of that.
no, I think it's pretty good. Okay, no,
But
because
when we're gonna walk a lot.
I wrote that all the steps around
Yeah,
just in case, but I think I put it in.
yeah. As long as you have a word.
Thanks.
I had feelings right there.
So I wanted to.
I don't want to
Bring
think
it
about
top.
this.
Yeah. That's what the choice.
Really?
It's,
He never graded anything to get feedback.
this point.
He never knew where you're at. He never put a grade.
This one was six way in the survey.
I don't know.
It's just-
He talked to him, like,
So essentially, it's like,
All right, it's 4 o'clock, so let's go and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? End of week 7, so we're after today, we have 2 more weeks until spring break. So that's exciting. It's an exciting prospect. I look forward to spring break as much as you guys do, because that's when I can catch up on all my other work. All right, so the plan for today is we have a set of lectures by today, and so we're not doing anything with the with notes. And so the lecture slides today is going to be on cardiovascular diseases and medical devices. Okay. And so, you know, we've spent the last few lectures talking about non-parameter modeling. And so I think this is kind of a good time to kind of step back and talk more about the clinical side of you know, of what we're doing. Okay. And I think this is timed really well too, because I think, you know, you guys are just finishing this vascular tutorial. And so I know you guys are thinking about your projects. And so a big part of your project is going to be this side of the content. And so it's thinking about what kinds of diseases and what kinds of medical devices are going to have an impact on your chosen geometry. Okay. A question in the chat. Yeah, it's yeah, I'm sure you know. I know a lot of you guys are seniors too, and so I know, you know, the last semester as an engineering student is always, you know, really exhausting. And so, you know, I hear you guys, you know, and I just, you know, just hang in there. You know, it's yeah, it's tough. I know. All right, and so announcements. And so the vascular tutorial is due tomorrow, I believe. So tomorrow at 11:59. So I've gotten a few questions in office hours about the software. So that's good. Okay. And so if you're still working on it, you know, definitely if you run into any issues, just shoot me an email. You know, I'll try my best to get back to you as soon as I can. You know, because it is a strange software. You know, it's not something that you've learned in a class. So, you know, anytime you pick up a new software, there's always going to be a lot of challenges and a lot of issues. And so, if you run into one of those, you run into an area that you're not sure what's going on, then, you know, please let me know, and I'll do my best to help you out. Okay. All right, and so I think that's all my announcements. And so, are there any questions I can answer before we get started today? Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and get started. So, you know, it's a big list of learning objectives, and so I know it's a lot, but it's all, you know, conceptual stuff. Okay. And, you know, just like the earlier lecture that we had on medical imaging, I'm hoping that this is something that's interesting, because, you know, this is quite different than I think that from the usual lectures that you have in your engineering classes, because it's all, it's a lot of pictures. It's kind of a lot of conceptual stuff, a lot of facts, more so than equations and calculations. Oops. Okay, so let's talk about cardiovascular disease. So what do I mean by cardiovascular disease? And so, a cardiovascular disease is kind of a very broad term that people usually use it to refer to any kind of abnormality in the cardiovascular system. And these abnormalities can cause disruptions in blood flow that lead to negative health consequences. Okay. And I think the surprising thing about a lot of these diseases is that, when you think of disease, I think when people say the word disease, they think of something like a viral infection or like a bacteria infection, something that's very biological in nature. But I think the surprising thing about cardiovascular disease is that a lot of them are very mechanical in nature. Okay. And so the analogy that, that I like to think about a lot with the cardiovascular system, that, even doctors, a lot of doctors I've talked to kind of share the same view. Your cardiovascular system is essentially plumbing, okay? And so when you have an issue with your plumbing in your house or in your apartment, right? So if your sink gets clogged, stuff like that, your cardiovascular system is vulnerable to those same issues. It's just that, we don't call them a plumbing issue, we call them a cardiovascular disease, okay? And so the diseases that I focused on for this lecture, so things like hypertension, which is high blood pressure, atherosclerosis and aneurysms, you'll see that these actually have very mechanical, very fluid mechanical explanations as to why they happen. And so why are we studying this? And so cardiovascular disease is a major cause of death. Okay, and so if you account for all the causes of death worldwide, cardiovascular disease will make up about half of it. Okay, and so that's huge. And so out of all the different ways that people can pass away, the fact that one category of afflictions makes up almost half of that is really significant, and that's why there's a lot of strong interest from the public and from the medical point of view into studying the cardiovascular system. Okay. And so if you're going to go into the line of work that that this class is defined as, or if you go to work for like a biomedical company, it's really important to understand what these diseases are and how they work, so that you can better design devices and better perform analysis based on them. Okay. And so after we talk about the diseases, I did want to talk about medical devices for a little bit. And so I know for the first homework, I had you guys do a little bit of a research project into medical devices, but I wanted to do kind of a more broader overview for today. Okay, so let's start with one of the most common cardiovascular diseases out there, which is hypertension. Okay. So hypertension is just the medical term for high blood pressure. Okay, and so the exact definition for hypertension is that it's an elevated blood pressure that arises as a result of many different fluid mechanical reasons. Okay, and so the way it's diagnosed in people is that they measure your blood pressure. And so everyone's probably gone to the doctor and they've had the cuff that's around their arm. The doctor pumps it up until you feel like your arm is suffocating, and then they let it go, right? Or you can go to CVS and stick your arm in the laser thing, and then they measure your blood pressure over there. And so if you have an elevated blood pressure, usually that's measured by you have a blood pressure that's at least 20 millimeters mercury above normal in systole, or 10 millimeters of mercury above the normal, which is diastole. Okay? So the ideal blood pressure for most people is 120/80. And so that means if you have a blood pressure of about 140/90, then that's considered high blood pressure. It's a rough estimate, for different age groups and for different types of population, what the cutoff for high blood pressure is different. And it's not like a binary thing too. It's not like if you're below 140, if you have 139 blood pressure, then you're like, oh, I'm good, I don't have high blood pressure. It's still not good. And so, you still have higher than normal blood pressure. But the clinical, I think, cutoff for high blood pressure for most people is 140/90. Okay. And so it affects a very large percentage of the population, actually. So I think a survey done in the UK recently found that about a third of adults have hypertension, which is very alarming, actually. Okay. And the main contributors to this have to do with your lifestyle. Okay? So that involves, a high amount of salt intake in your diet, reduced levels of exercise, and stress plays a role as well. And high blood pressure by itself is you can live with high blood pressure for a while. The high blood pressure itself is not going to kill you. It's not like your blood vessels are suddenly going to explode from a high amount of pressure, but it does place a lot of strain on the rest of the cardiovascular system. So that's where the concern comes in. And so high blood pressure is a major risk factor for some big events like a heart attack, like stroke, like kidney disease, and also aneurysms, which we're going to talk about later as well. Okay. And I think we talked about blood pressure a bit when we talked about arterial biomechanics, and that the main reason why it puts you at risk for a lot of these things, that a higher blood pressure just makes your heart work a lot harder than it has to. Okay? And the main treatments and and management of high blood pressure mostly involve lifestyle changes. Okay, and so it involves increased exercise, a better diet, mostly reduce the salt in your diet. Okay, and that helps people manage their blood pressure. Okay, and so let's talk about how we actually quantify. And so blood pressure, is something that's cyclical in your body, right? And we talked about, your blood pressure goes up and down as your heart beats and relaxes. Right? And so there's two parameters to consider when you're measuring blood pressure. And so the first one is the pulse pressure. And so the pulse pressure is just the difference between your systolic and your diastolic pressure. Right? And so if you look at the figure right here, you can see that the difference between the absolute peak and the absolute value, this is known as your pulse pressure. Okay? And so for a normal person, or I'd say not a normal person, a healthy person, okay, a blood pressure of 120/80, right? That means their max here is 120, and their min here is 80, right? Then their pulse pressure would be the difference between these two, which is 40 millimeters per mercury. Okay. All right, and so the main things that determine your your pulse pressure are your stroke volume and the stiffness of your blood vessels. Okay. All right, so that's one metric for blood pressure. The other metric for blood pressure is your mean pressure. Okay, so your mean pressure is just simply the time average blood pressure over one cardiac cycle. Okay, and so over one heartbeat, we take the average of what your blood pressure is, and that is your mean pressure. Okay. And so the main determinants for your mean pressure are going to be your cardiac output, or how much blood your heart outputs, per second, and the total vascular resistance of your capillary bed. Okay. And we've already worked with this before. And so, when we did our lump parameter, unit, we used the mean blood pressure to determine our vascular resistance, right? And so what we said was that resistance is equal to mean pressure divided by cardiac output, or in other words, the flow rate. Okay. And we've already seen that this is essentially our Ohm's law, right? We said P is equal to QR, which is the same as V is equal to IR. Okay. And one formula I don't have here is that there's actually a relationship in between, the pulse pressure and the mean pressure. Okay. And so even though everyone's pressure waveforms looks slightly different, they all kind of follow the same rough shape. Okay. And so they're accompanied by a very sharp rise and then a slow decrease. Okay. So most pressure waveforms kind of look like that. And so if you know your systolic pressure and your diastolic pressure, you can actually use that to compute your mean pressure. Okay. And the formula for that is, like the following. So what you do is you take your systolic pressure, which is your max blood pressure over a cycle. Okay. You multiply it by 1/3. Okay. And then to this, you take your diastolic. Okay, and you multiply this by 2/3. Okay. And this equals your mean pressure. Okay. Right. And so the reason it's not 50-50, right? And so I think when most people look at this, they might just take your systolic pressure, your diastolic pressure, add them together, divide by 2. The reason it's not 50-50 is that you spend more of your heart cycle kind of in this relaxation phase. Okay. And so you only go above the you only reach the maximum for a short amount of time, just because of how the heart kind of pumps and relaxes. Okay. And so that's why you have this kind of 1/3, 2/3 relationship to get the mean. And so for a typical person, I think if we plug in 120 here and we plug in 80, I think you get a mean pressure of about 91.333, repeating, of course, in millimeters of mercury. Okay. And so for a normal healthy person, that's going to be their mean blood pressure. Okay. Any questions on this?
What's the units again? Is it beats per minute?
For the blood pressure?
Yeah.
So the blood pressure is in units of millimeters of mercury. And so that refers to how, if you have a manometer, right? If you have a fluid, you can measure the pressure using a fluid column. And so how much the fluid column rises, that's a measurement of pressure. And so in the olden days, before digital readouts and everything, doctors used to measure pressure with these kinds of manometers. And they used liquid mercury because it was very heavy compared to most fluids. And so, you could measure the blood pressure without having a manometer the size of a building. All right, any other questions on this? Okay, and so now that we know the metrics for blood pressure, let's see how they relate to hypertension. Okay, and so the main cause for hypertension, in most people, and so I wouldn't say this applies to everyone, but for most people, it depends on their age. Okay, and so if you're a relatively young person, so if let's say that you're a teenager or you're a kid, right, and if you have a high blood pressure, nowadays it's becoming more and more due to diet, but the ones that are relatively healthy otherwise, if they have hypertension, it's usually due to the fact that they have very high stroke volumes. Okay, and remember, the stroke volume is the volume of blood that your heart ejects in one beat. Okay, and so for kids basically that have high blood pressure, what that usually means is that their heart or one of their heart chambers is kind of abnormally big. So when it pumps, then it ejects just a very large amount of blood out into the cardiovascular system, and that causes a higher blood pressure. Okay, but we call this isolated systolic hypertension because it's you only have hypertension in the fact that your max is really high. Your minimum blood pressure is fine. Okay, and so for these kids, they might have a blood pressure of like 140/80. Okay, and so their diastolic pressure is fine, but their systolic one is abnormally high because of that. Okay. Yeah, question.
You said when they have one larger vein.
One larger heart chamber, one larger ventricle. Yeah. Okay, so for middle-aged people, if you're diagnosed with hypertension, they usually have what's called mixed hypertension. Okay, and so for mixed hypertension, both the systolic and diastolic pressure are raised. Okay. And this is mostly due to the narrowing and the stiffening of their capillary bed. Okay, and so the capillaries that exist in all their muscles and their lungs, those are abnormally narrow compared to a healthier person, and so that leads to a higher blood pressure. Okay. Then as you transition into an older adult, that has hypertension. Again, it's expressed as an isolated systolic hypertension, and so it looks kind of like the young adults one, but the physical reasoning for it is different. Okay, and the main physical reason why older people tend to have higher blood pressure is their blood vessels start to stiffen. Okay? And so their blood vessels are not as flexible as they used to be. This is just a natural cause of aging. Right? So as you age, your blood vessels, they tend to fatigue, and so that's one factor. But they also just through that fatigue, they lose a lot of their elastic properties, like their elastin, like their collagen. Those get kind of weaker. And so because of that stiffening, then the blood vessels, create a higher blood pressure.
Question.
Yeah.
Is this kind of like related to? I forgot what the proper name is, but it started with the E something with E cells, where I think it had the ability for veins that slowly gradually expand.
Yeah, so you're thinking of endothelial cells.
Yeah.
It is a little bit, and so for older people, those endothelial cells they lose a lot of their material properties, and so they become stiffer, And so, but that's just a natural cause of aging. Yeah. I mean, of course, if you live a healthy lifestyle, you know, going into your old age, then that helps. And so that helps your blood vessels kind of maintain a lot of these properties. But yeah, most people kind of lose a lot of those things. Okay. All right, any other questions on this? Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the stiffening effect, because it's something that relates to, you know, what we've talked about before with arterial biomechanics. And so I think it's worth you know, talking about again. Okay? And so just like we've talked about before, you know, when the heart contracts, it sends this pressure wave along your blood vessels, right? And then eventually this pressure wave hits your capillary bed, you know, and then reflects back. Okay, and so you have this wave propagation and wave reflection that's going on in your cardiovascular system. Okay. And when the reflected wave meets with a forward going wave, then their pressure amplitudes add, and you end up with a higher amount of you know, higher amount of blood pressure. Okay. And remember, one thing that we talked about was the speed at which, you know, the waves travel down depends really strongly on the stiffness of the vessel walls. Okay. And so stiffer vessel walls, you know, in other words, one way you can quantify is that these vessel walls have a higher Young's modulus. And so vessel walls with a higher Young's modulus will propagate these waves at a much higher speed. Okay. And so because of that, for older people, what you'll see is that the waves are traveling, they're going down the vessels much faster, they're reflecting back, and you're having this ping pong effect that happens, you know, a lot more than younger people. Okay? And so because of that, because you have a lot more waves kind of ping ponging, you know, throughout your cardiovascular system, you have a lot more waves that kind of add their amplitudes on each other, you know, which results in the higher blood vessels or higher blood pressures that we, you know, that we talked about. Okay. A faster wave speed also means that the waves will dissipate a lot slower too. Okay. So remember we talked about, you know, eventually, you know, and this is true for a string too. So if you take a string and you put a wave down the string, eventually that wave is going to die down, right? Because of friction and you know, and other dissipative factors within the string. Okay. But if the wave is moving a lot faster, then it's going to reflect a lot more times before it eventually dissipates. Down. Okay. And so that's kind of another factor of why, you know, stiffer blood vessels lead to higher blood pressure. Okay. Any final questions on hypertension before we move on to atherosclerosis? All right, so let's talk about the next disease now, which is atherosclerosis. Okay, so I think everyone kind of is familiar with atherosclerosis because it's something that's talked about in, you know, I remember when I was a kid, I used to watch like Cheerios commercials, you know, like Happy Heart commercials, things like that. And so when you actually think of like cardiovascular disease, you know, this is probably the one that a lot of people imagine. Okay. And so what atherosclerosis is it's basically a buildup of fatty deposits, or, you know, in other words called plaque, onto your vessel walls. Okay. And so this is kind of an animation that I think people have seen before, where, you know, you know, as a kid, you know, maybe you were shown an image like this, like these are your blood vessels, right? All this fat right here, that's like the In-N-Out burger that you ate the other day, right? So all the fat is depositing on your blood vessel walls, and that makes it a lot harder for your blood to travel through. Okay. All right, and so, you know, this narrowing is bad, of course, okay, because you never want to impede the blood flow in your body, right? And if you do, like if you do have a significant amount of plaque buildup, then it can reduce blood perfusion or blood flow to critical areas of your body, like your heart and your brain. Okay. Another big risk of atherosclerosis that I think not a lot of people are aware about is that these plaque caps right here can rupture. Okay. And so, you know, it's bad when these plaques build up on your vessel walls, you know, but they're at least they're relatively contained. Okay. So we'll learn in a bit that, you know, when you have plaque buildup on your vessel walls, they're protected by something called a fibrous cap. Okay. But what can happen sometimes is that the fibrous cap can burst, and then you'll have like a sudden outpouring or sudden burst of fatty deposits that's just traveling in your blood vessels. Okay? And that can be a really bad thing, because if this happens in a relatively larger vessel and you have big chunks of fat that are floating down your cardiovascular tree, And then if that chunk of fat gets stuck into like, one of the little capillaries in your lungs, that can lead to a lot of damage too. Okay. And so rupture of atherosclerosis is a big concern that I think not a lot of people think about over time. Okay. And the scary thing about atherosclerosis is that it's not what's called an acute disease. And so this is something that builds up slowly over time. And so it's really the result of kind of a lifestyle of choices that people make, and a lifestyle or a lifetime of diet choices that people make. Okay. And so for a lot of people, it actually starts pretty early in their childhood or maybe in their adolescence. And then, as you get older, then these problems get worse. And then, and then finally they manifest as an adult when, things might be a little bit too late to change anything. Okay. And so there's a lot of treatments that are available for atherosclerosis. And so there are things like bypass surgeries that we'll talk about. You can surgically remove some of the plaque in some extreme cases, or you can use a device called a stent. But what I don't have here is that, I think the most common way that people treat this is just through, again, lifestyle changes. So exercising better, watching what you eat, eating more fiber, these are all things that can help with, with atherosclerosis. Okay. All right, any questions on this? Okay, so let's look at an animate, or not really an animation, but let's look at the progression of atherosclerosis over time. Okay, and so on the top left right here, I have an image of a healthy artery. Okay, and so a healthy artery you can see is fully formed. Okay, and so we have a nice circular cross section, and there's nothing obstructing the blood flow. Okay, you'll see this term a lot today, and I'll use this term throughout this class as well. And so you'll hear me use the term lumen a lot. And so the term lumen, all that really means that this is the portion of your blood vessel where the blood is flowing. Okay. Okay. Because your blood vessel is comprised of, kind of the empty part in the middle. And so the empty part in the middle is where the blood flows, but it's also comprised of your vessel wall as well. Okay. And so when you hear the term lumen, all lumen usually basically means it's just the empty part of the tube of your blood vessel. Okay. And so that's where the blood itself is supposed to go. Okay. And so in the very early stages of atherosclerosis, what you're going to have are these what's called fatty streaks. Okay. And so, they're a little bit hard to notice, but fat is basically starting to deposit on the vessel wall. Okay, and those appear as these kind of streaks that are in your blood vessel. All right, the next stage of atherosclerosis is intimal thickening. Okay, and so in this stage, more fat starts to deposit into the vessel wall, and not only that, but your body is also sending. It kind of senses this as kind of an abnormality in your blood vessel, and so it also sends additional cells and additional material to help kind of combat the fat. Okay? But all of that kind of builds up. Okay, and so it builds up in this kind of layer, which kind of thickens over time. Okay? But the important part of this phase, and what makes it really hard to detect, is that the lumen is not yet affected. Okay, and so what you're seeing is that if you compare stage B and stage C, the lumen is approximately the same. And so the first stages of atherosclerosis actually grows outward. Okay, and so all this extra plaque, you can see that it's kind of bulging out like this, but it's not bulging inwards towards the lumen. Okay? And the reason for this is that your body is trying to preserve as much blood flow as it can. Okay. And so next you see, stage D right here, which is early plaque. And so in early plaque, all the fatty deposits that come into your blood vessel wall, they start to kind of pool together. Okay, you have this kind of large area of plaque that's connected. Okay, and so we call this plaque right here. Okay. Right, and so if that continues to progress, then you get to late stage plaque like this, where finally, in this stage, the atherosclerosis is actually growing inwards towards your blood vessel. Okay? And so stage E is the first stage where you actually have a reduction in the lumen. Okay. And then if it gets really serious, then this area right here, this kind of light gray area, tends to thin out. Okay. And so really bad atherosclerosis will have a very large plaque area with a very thin cap that's protecting it, okay? And this is really dangerous because, you know, like I mentioned before, that, you know, if this plaque ruptures, and, you know, and it's very likely to rupture because it has such a thin cap, then all this fat is just going to come gushing out into your cardiovascular system, and it's going to go in these big chunks that are very, very dangerous. Okay? Because to build up to this point, you know, there wasn't like a big, you know, chunk of fat that just decided to start living in your blood vessel wall. You know, it kind of builds up kind of very slowly over time. So fat particle here, fat particle there, okay? And so to have that large amount of fat kind of traveling as one big pack at once, you know, is really dangerous for your cardiovascular system. All right, any questions on this? Okay, and so how does this affect the flow, right? And so kind of the most idealized shape for an atherosclerosis plaque is something like this, okay? And so what you have is basically a reduction in the lumen, okay? And so you have kind of like almost like a nozzle effect right here, okay? And so I'm gonna define another medical term for you. And so anytime you have a narrowing of the blood vessel, or anytime you have a reduction of the lumen, the medical term for that is called stenosis, okay? And so if you hear the term stenosis, all that means that your blood vessel is being narrowed. It doesn't necessarily have to be because of atherosclerosis, although atherosclerosis is you know, one of the more common ways that this can happen. Okay, and so now that we have this geometry right here, so we have this kind of nozzle effect going on, you know, we can analyze this from a fluid mechanics point of view, right? And so first thing we should notice is that, you know, because we have this sharp reduction in area, you know, because of conservation of mass, what that tells us is that as the blood flows through the narrowing, then the blood velocity has to speed up. Right? Because remember, mass has to be conserved. And so the flow rate, which is the area of cross-sectional area times the velocity, has to be constant throughout this entire blood vessel. Okay. And the point of maximum velocity actually occurs, you know, very slightly after the minimum area at a location called the vena contracta. Okay. And so that occurs very kind of slightly after the stenosis. Okay. Right. And so after stenosis, what you'll have is a sharp increase in area. And so this is almost like a diffuser you can think about. Okay. And because the area kind of opens up so quickly, what you have are these kind of recirculation zones. Okay. And these recirculation zones are a result of the boundary layer of the flow separating here. And so these recirculation zones are also kind of dangerous in their own ways as well, okay? Because what they can lead to is low areas of wall shear stress, okay? And remember, we talked about a lot about how wall shear stress is an important quantity for your blood vessels, okay? And so if you have a low wall shear stress there, that can cause your blood vessels to kind of maladapt or adapt poorly to those situations. And then on the converse side, you know, because the flow is speeding up a lot to get through the stenosis, you're going to have an area of high wall shear stress, you know, in this area over here, okay? Because the flow is going just a lot faster. So over here we have high wall shear stress.
Is the flow recirculation like a turbulent flow, or is it like a vortex?
It's more like a vortex. Yeah. And so a lot of times it doesn't get to the high enough speeds to go turbulent. So it's, you know, it's kind of a smooth kind of recirculation. All right, any questions on this? Okay. Okay, so let's talk about pressure now. Right? And so pressure, you know, the pressure is really interesting actually, because because you know, the flow has to accelerate so much to get through the gap. Okay, what you're going to see is that pressure actually drops really dramatically as it goes through stenosis. Okay, you know, and a large part of this is due to a lot of the viscous friction or viscous losses that occur, you know, in this neck area right here. Okay, and the amount of pressure drop that you see actually increases with the severity of the disease. Okay, and so if you have a vessel that's even more constricted than this, okay, and so if the constriction is something like this, right, and so there's barely a little window here for the blood to go through, then you're going to have an even higher pressure drop. Okay. And and we can explain that pressure drop, purely just from a fluid mechanics perspective. Okay. And the interesting thing is that based on the fluid mechanics of the situation, doctors have actually developed a metric that's based on those on that pressure drop. Okay. And so there's a clinical quantity called fractional flow reserve, or people shorten it a lot. They call it FFR. Okay. Now, the way that they measure FFR is the ratio of the pressure before a disease or before stenosis and after the stenosis. Okay. And so the way they measure that is they literally stick a wire into your blood vessel. Okay. And this wire has a pressure probe. Okay. And so what they'll do is that, if you have an area of your body where they suspect that there's disease, what they're going to do is they're going to use the probe, they're going to use the catheter to measure the pressure here. Okay, so we'll call this P1. Right. Then what they'll do is they'll advance the probe slightly past the stenosis until it's about right here. Okay. Okay. Then they'll measure P2. Then they'll simply just take a ratio of P2 over P1. Okay. And this ratio of P2 over P1, this is our FFR. Right. And so because it's a ratio, it expresses basically how much pressure loss or how much pressure drop that you get by going through the stenosis. Okay. And so if the FFR is less than 0.8, then what doctors say is that this disease is actually really significant. And so they should actually do something about it. Okay. And so for a lot of diseases, right, especially in your coronary arteries, which are the blood vessels around your heart, they use the FFR here to decide, whether they should do an operation or not. Okay. Because the interesting thing about stenoses is that it's not that hard to see them from medical image data. And so a lot of times people will go in, they'll get a scan, they'll get a CT scan of their body, or they'll get an X-ray, and doctors can see, that there's like, oh, you have a stenosis right here. Okay. And so there are a lot of stenoses that look kind of bad in the image data, that might make it seem like the doctor should operate. Okay. The interesting thing is that, even for the stenoses that look really bad, they may not be what they call functionally significant. Okay. Because for some vessels, depending on the geometry, right, and so maybe this blood vessel is curved, or maybe maybe it's closer to the heart, or maybe it's farther from the heart. Okay. For some blood vessels, it's actually that even if you have a narrowing like that, the blood might still be able to get through just fine. Okay. And so there's a lot of cases where you have a blood vessel, and there'll be some disease, and the doctor will be like, I don't know how severe this is. What they'll do is they'll measure FFR. Okay. And if the FFR comes back with something large, like maybe the FFR is like 0.95. Right. And so that basically means that we've only lost about 5% of our pressure going through the stenosis. Then the doctor will say, this stenosis is not actually hurting you all that much. And so they can opt to, not do the surgery or not do any treatment, and save you a lot of money and a lot of trouble. Okay. But with that said, even though this FFR is very well trusted, and doctors know that this is a great metric, that's hard. That's a hard sell to some patients sometimes, because a lot of times, the doctor will be going through, your scans with you, and probably your family members are in there with you too. Okay. And then if the doctor shows like you have a big ass, stenosis here in your blood vessel, but I'm not going to do anything about it because it's actually not that significant. I think the common reaction that people are going to have is like, are you sure? Like, I think you should do something about it. So, what tends to happen a lot in hospitals is that there are a lot of, I wouldn't say unnecessary, but I would say kind of overly cautious surgeries that people elect to do, because they try to fix something that looks like this. Okay. Where stenosis might look bad kind of visually, but functionally it's actually not that severe. Okay. Which is not a bad thing. which I can understand, because this is someone's life on the line, right? So, if this is, especially if it's a loved one, you're going to be, of course, you're going to be abundantly cautious, right? So even if the doctor says that, this is fine, most people will pay the premium, or they'll go through the surgery, to be overly cautious with them, which is totally understandable. That's that, I think that's the reasonable thing to do.
Wouldn't any change in velocity be a bad thing?
Not necessarily, because it's all about how the body kind of responds to it. And so if the body kind of is not really reacting to it, or it's not really affecting anything else in the body, like your muscles and all your organs are getting oxygen and nutrients just fine. And if your heart doesn't have to work any harder, then it's not harming you in any way. It's just kind of there. The interesting thing, and the reason I like to bring up FFR a lot, is that there's kind of a success story for our field. And so there's a company up there, and so this company is based in NorCal called HeartFlow, where they kind of base their entire business around FFR. Okay. And so what I mean by that is that normally when doctors measure FFR, they have to do it invasively. So they have to stick a wire up into you to measure the pressure, right? So that's really invasive, and a lot of people don't like wires being stuck in them for no reason. And so what HeartFlow does is they use basically the exact same methods that we're using in this class to measure FFR, right? And so what they say is that, we don't have to stick a wire inside someone. We can just run a CFD. We can just run a simulation, and we can compute that, okay? Because pressure, relatively speaking, is really easy to compute with CFD compared to, wall shear stress and other stuff. And so, what HeartFlow says, like, we have the technology, we don't have to stick wires at people. And so that's kind of how they run their business, right? So that's kind of, I would say the most successful story that's come out of this technology, within the last few years. I have quite a few colleagues that work there too. It's a great company. All right, any questions on this?
Yeah, just going back to the previous question. So then the increase of pressure can be fine for the system after the fact. Absolutely. The fatty.
So if the pressure drop is this severe, this usually is not good. And so this basically tells would tell the doctor that your heart is working this much harder. Okay. And so large pressure drop means that your heart has to basically work harder to elevate the pressure up here to get the blood through that stenosis. And so that's not a good thing. And so that's something that you would have to go fix. But if the pressure plot looks something like this, okay, and so let me draw the same line here. Just pretend that it's straight. Okay. And so the pressure plot looks something like this, where you only had just a modest decrease, okay, right? Then this tells the doc that your heart's not really working that much harder, and you're not really losing that much going through the stenosis. And so this is something that we could probably leave it alone, and you'll probably be just fine.
So they're kind of just gauging the size of it based on pressure.
Exactly, right. Because a lot of times, if just by visually looking at it, that doesn't tell you the whole story. Because you can visually see, you can visually see that this blood vessel is really gunked up. Like there's a really small narrowing, but sometimes your body can deal with that just fine. And so even if there's a small narrowing, some bodies can adapt to that, and some bodies can can make it work so that they either redirect the blood flow, or they kind of rearrange some other things so that it's not functionally significant. And a lot of times you don't know that unless you actually look at the fluid mechanics of the situation. Yeah, I love this, because it's one thing where, like, it's I think pressure drop through a narrowing, I think, is something that a lot of engineers kind of just know a lot after taking fluid mechanics. But it's something that's kind of made an impact on the way how doctors perform their work too, and it's something that's just purely fluid mechanics, which is really cool. Okay, and so kind of building off that, here's kind of another way to show that even if you have a narrowing in your blood vessel, sometimes it's not all that significant. Okay. And so what tends to happen is that if you do have a narrowing in your blood vessel, it actually takes a while for it to actually affect the amount of flow that's going through the vessel. Okay. So this plot is really weird, and I forget how to read this plot until 5 minutes before the lecture when I'm reviewing my notes. But you should actually read this plot from right to left. Okay. And so I think the easiest way to read this plot is through through these images right here. Okay. And so on the rightmost here we have a vessel that's fully open, and so this vessel right here is the healthy blood vessel. Okay, that says healthy right here. Okay. And then as you get more and more disease, you end up going to the left. Okay. Right. And so what this is showing is that for the early stages of the disease, where the blood vessel is narrowing is not that severe, all the way up until about 60%. Okay. The flow rate in your blood vessel tends to be about constant, actually, which is really interesting. And so the blood vessel, its cross-sectional area at this point has been reduced by 60%. But what this is saying is that even in those situations, the body can adapt so that it maintains the same amount of flow through that vessel. Okay. And the way it compensates for this is that it makes the vessels downstream of that stenosis much bigger. Okay. And so these are your arterioles, and so those are kind of the smaller vessels that are downstream of your stenosis or downstream of your disease. Okay, and so if your body can sense that hey, something upstream is getting plugged up, right? What your body can do is that downstream of that, they can actually open up those blood vessels more to kind of compensate for that, for that loss. Okay. And so by a lot of measurements that doctors have taken, that your blood vessel can actually be reduced by about 70% before it actually has any functional impact on the flow. Okay. And this threshold right here, about 30%, this is called critical stenosis. Okay. So this is a really cool fact, right? And so your body the human body is a very fascinating thing, right? And so it has a lot of ways to adapt to certain situations, especially something like this. Okay. But this is also bad in a certain way too, because if it takes this much disease, 70%, if it takes this much disease for you to kind of sense something's going wrong, by that point usually something's really wrong, and you have to have probably some kind of major surgery or kind of some major intervention in order to make sure that you're healthy again. Okay. And so it's amazing, but also not great for warning you of anything going on. Okay, so let's talk about how plaque initiates. Okay, because the way plaque or the way fatty deposits kind of deposit into your bloodstream is not random. Okay. And so what clinical measurements have shown is that atherosclerosis tends to accumulate or tends to develop at kind of the same locations in a person's body all the time. Okay. And some of these locations are for example, places like bifurcations. Okay. And so whenever blood vessel splits, okay, those are areas that are very commonly diseased with atherosclerosis. Okay. And so what's unique about these regions that you can predict, just purely based on the fluid mechanics, and so nothing biological, is that the shear stresses or the wall shear stress in these regions tend to be pretty low. Okay. I remember what we said about wall shear stress, right? So remember your endothelial cells, or the cells that line your blood vessel wall, they can sense this wall shear stress. Okay. And so because these areas here tend to have lower wall shear stress because of the fluid mechanics of the situation, then that makes them more vulnerable to fat being deposited there. And so, what you'll see often is that, if you run like a CFD simulation on this, you'll see that these areas right here, kind of these shoulder areas, tend to have lower wall shear stress. And then over time, this is where, atherosclerosis tends to develop the most. Okay. Right. Another interesting feature of these regions is that they have wall shear stress that are not only low in magnitude, but they also tend to change directions a lot. Okay. And so what I mean by that is that the wall shear stress vector, kind of goes from forward to back, or maybe left to right quite a lot. Okay. And this kind of rapidly changing wall shear stress is also a good predictor of disease location as well. Okay. And so in fact, there's a metric called OSI, which stands for Oscillatory Shear Index. Okay. OSI has been known to kind of predict where a lot of these diseases tend to occur. Okay. And the nice thing about OSI is that this is something that's automatically computed from Symbasco. Okay. And so you'll see later in the class that, when you run it won't show up for a steady simulation, but if you run a pulsatile simulation or something with a varying waveform, you'll be able to have OSI as one of your outputs. Okay. And so based on those simulation results, you can see that, you can see certain areas that are going to light up in red on your model. That, these are areas of potential disease risk. And so these are areas that, maybe we should look at, from a clinical point of view. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. All right, so let's talk about growth and rupture. Okay, and so remember, like we talked about before, that when plaque starts to build up in your body, it first grows outward. Okay, and so this plaque, when this started, it didn't have this hump before. The first thing it did was it kind of grew outwards into this kind of outward bump right here. And again, the reason for that is so that your blood vessel can try to maintain the same cross-sectional area as before. Okay, and so, but if the plaque continues to develop, and so there's more there's more fat that gets deposited there, then this plaque will start to grow inward. Okay, and so this is when it starts to impede. The interesting thing is that if you compare the behavior of the stenosis before the stenosis and after the stenosis, they have very different widths of their fibrous cap. Okay, and so let's look at the upstream side first. So for the upstream side, the way that the blood velocity looks like is that you'll have a lot of the blood velocity kind of colliding with this hill right here. Okay, and so because we have a lot of collisions there, what tends to happen is that you have a higher amount of wall shear stress at the front end. Okay, and this higher amount of friction at the front tends to kind of wear down. You can think of it as almost like wearing down the stenosis. And so what tends to happen there is you have a thin fibrous cap. Okay, and so if you look at the thickness of this part right here, okay, right, that's the only thing that's protecting your the stenosis from kind of barfing out a bunch of fat cells into your blood vessel. Right, this is really thin because of that high viscous wall shear stress. If you compare that to the downstream side, where the downstream side actually has very low wall shear stress, partially because of that recirculation, this tends to have a much thicker cap. Okay, and so you can see here that the stenosis cap there is much thicker than before. All right, just like we talked about before, that if this ruptures, and so if this if this cap right here breaks, and all this fatty deposits kind of come out into your blood vessel, that's really bad. Okay, and so that can either clog up the vessels themselves, or it can actually trigger your blood itself to clot as well. Okay, and so is everyone familiar with the term coagulation? And so that's when basically blood kind of curdles and kind of forms into a solid. And so what tends to happen is that if your blood is kind of exposed to a large amount of fat like this all at once, then that kind of triggers that coagulation reaction. So the blood itself will be like, I don't like this, and then they'll form a clot themselves, and that will block up the blood vessels too. And of course, that's a bad thing as well. Okay, and so plaque rupture is actually a really big deal. And so usually if someone has a significant plaque rupture in their body, it usually leads to some kind of adverse cardiovascular event, something either like a heart attack or a stroke or something like that. So it's a pretty serious thing. Okay. All right, any questions on this?
So at the molecular level, is like fatty cells hard to break down?
It is, yes, especially inside your blood vessels. So your blood doesn't have anything that it can do to kind of break down that stuff. So that's why it kind of all tends to clump together within your blood vessels.
There's like no medicine that can do that.
There is, and so for a lot of for people with that are known to have high levels of cholesterol in their bloodstreams, then there's some medicine that you can take to help break that down. Yeah, my father actually takes because he has high cholesterol, so he takes medicine to kind of lower that stuff. Yeah, so cholesterol. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this is referred as high cholesterol.
Yeah, cholesterol is a type of fat, and so cholesterol is one type of fat that can deposit into here. And so it doesn't happen all at once. And so when when you say that, when doctors say you have high cholesterol, it's not because you have something like this necessarily in your blood vessels, but you have high amounts of cholesterol molecules that are floating around, and then over time those small molecules will accumulate into something like this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk about treatments. And so how is atherosclerosis treated? So the interesting thing about this disease is that there's a wide variety of treatments out there available. Okay? And the unfortunate thing is that for a lot of people, it's often detected like a little bit too late, and so a lot of the treatments that you see and that you hear about are these often really extreme cases, like like open heart surgery, or like they had to have a stent involved or something like that. Okay. But there's a lot of other things that can happen along the way. Okay. And so this tag here is a little bit of a misnomer. So these are some, except for number 2, 1, 2, 1, 3, and 4. These are kind of treatments that you can have once it kind of gets that too late kind of once it gets to the kind of really late stage. Okay. But the most ideal case that doctors will go for if it's detected pretty early is basically drugs and medicine. Okay, and so we call this a pharmacological treatment option. Okay, and so these can be administered to either break up the cholesterol in your bloodstreams, or it can alter it can kind of alter the way the hormones of how your cardiovascular system works. Okay, to kind of help the fat kind of get processed and to kind of move through without building up. But if the plaque gets to the point where like you have like a significant blockage, like something like here, okay, then you have to take, usually the intervention is surgery of some kind. Okay. And so one type of surgery is called plaque removal. And so if the plaque is occurring at certain parts of the body where it's easy for a surgeon to access it, they can actually go in and kind of remove the plaque. They kind of like almost like kind of scrape it out from your blood vessels. Okay. And so this is not always possible because not every blood vessel in your body is kind of easily accessed for that, but it's common in your carotid arteries. And so your carotids are your arteries that lead up to your brain. Okay. And so there's a method that's out there that can help remove that plaque. Okay. Another type of treatment is either angioplasty or a stent. Okay. And I know some of you did stents for your for your first homework. And so for this treatment, what happens is that the doctors will kind of snake a catheter or snake a wire through your body, okay, up until the point where there's plaque, and then what they'll do is they'll release a device to kind of, visually it kind of looks like it smushes the plaque against the wall, okay, and the hope is that by kind of smushing the plaque like that, then it kind of opens up your blood vessel again, so that blood can kind of flow through, okay. And for a lot of these stents, they actually leave the device in there, so it can actually help to prevent the stenosis from reoccurring again. This is really nice, actually. Even though it is technically an operation, it is technically a surgery, but it's a lot less severe than option 1 or option 4. Okay. And just by experience, doctors will often opt for a stent when the stenosis is just kind of like a one-off. And so if you have something like, and let me change the color a little bit. So if you have something like this, okay, even though this diagram here is for bypass surgery, if it's something like this where it's just one plaque, right, just kind of by itself, from my experience, I think doctors will usually opt for a stent here, because then that's very easy. They can snake a wire in here, smush that plaque to the side, and then it kind of opens up that point vessel. Okay. But for very extreme cases where you have a lot of plaque, and so let's say that you have plaque right there, you have plaque up here, okay, you have plaque over here, okay. And this is common, so this is not something that doesn't happen often. Those are the kind of cases where a stent is not going to help that much, because you have to stent up basically the entire artery. And so what doctors will do is they'll opt for bypass surgery, okay. And so what they'll do is they'll basically open up your chest, okay, and they'll take another blood vessel, okay, and then they'll use it to route blood around the stenosis, okay, because the goal of these blood vessels is to basically perfuse, or to basically route nutrients and oxygen, downstream of the stenosis, okay. And if the stenosis are blocking that from happening, you know, one way to fix that is just to make another blood vessel that just goes around. Okay. Hence the name bypass. And so you're basically bypassing the disease in your body. Okay. And you know, from my experience and from my, you know, from talking to doctors a lot, you know, oftentimes bypass is the option when you have multiple amounts of disease, right? So if you have something like this, or if you have, you know, another blood vessel that's severely diseased right here, okay? And so what surgeons have told me is that, you know, they very rarely go into a patient and just stick one graft in there, okay? That never happens. And so if they're gonna open up your chest, you know, they're gonna make it worth it. And so, you know, everyone that gets their chest open, you know, they're gonna have at least 2, you know, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, and I've even seen a patient get 5 bypasses, you know, in one surgery, which is, you know, crazy. You know, I think that patient was out for like, you know, the surgery was almost like 20 hours, which is kind of a crazy thing. And so, you know, if you have to have a bypass, usually it's really serious, and you know, you know, you have disease in multiple places. That's what I've been told about these things. And we'll talk about grafts a bit later, maybe not today, because you know, it is almost 5 o'clock already. But you know, grafts themselves are a very interesting technology too, because it's actually, you know, more difficult than you think to like take a blood vessel from from somewhere else in your body and stick it in. And the way your body works, you can't just put like a rubber tube in your body either, because that's also not going to work. So grafts are, you know, they look very simple because they just look like a tube, you know, but there's a lot of really interesting research that's going on in there as well. All right, any questions on this?
How would they ensure that all the flow would go into that bypass instead of just redirecting that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And so, you know, a big part of that is they attach it to vessels where they know the pressure is going to be really high. And so for a lot of these bypasses occur off the aorta. And so the aorta is your biggest blood vessel. It's also where the pressure is going to be the highest. And so they pick a high pressure blood vessel so that we know that we have high blood pressure here, and that's going to push the blood through the bypass no matter what. And of course, you know, they have to be really careful with the sutures here. They have to make sure that the connections are really good. And so it's a very delicate, very, you know, intense process.
Yeah, when we're talking about bypassing, is it using like artificial blood vessels to bypass it, or okay?
It's interesting. So that's what I was talking about before with grafts. And so the preferred thing is actually to take a blood vessel out of the same person's body and then put it somewhere else, because then the body already kind of knows it, and so it already knows that these are my cells, and so I'm not going to attack it, do anything weird to it. The interesting thing is that if you put something foreign in there, like you put just like you go to Home Depot, you get a rubber tube, you know, your body can detect that. And so what happens is that if your body detects something foreign, it'll actually try to attack it. And so it'll actually send like, you know, antibodies. It'll send like white blood cells over there and say, hey, you know, beat the crap out of this thing. This thing is foreign. And in the worst cases, you know, your body will try to fight the artificial tube, and it'll actually send so many cells there that the blood actually coagulates and clots there. And so if you have a graft here where it's supposed to reroute blood, but if the graft itself clots, you know, then it's useless. Then it's not doing its job. And so doctors have to be really careful about what materials they put there so that the body accepts it.
You also have to take like certain medicines how your body don't do that.
Yes. Yeah. There's different medicines that you can take too. And so, you know, if you do happen to have a bypass, you know, the recovery process is very, very long. So, you know, oftentimes you're in the hospital for a while, and they kind of monitor you, and, you know, they kind of make sure you get your meds and everything. So, yeah, it's scary. Yeah, it's an intense process. I mean, it's really cool that we can do this. It's really cool that, you know, that this is a thing, but, you know, it's definitely not something that is comfortable. All right, any other questions on this? Okay, so that's atherosclerosis. Okay, so next I want to talk about aneurysms. And so aneurysms is kind of a general term for any kind of unnatural swelling of your blood vessels. Okay, and so sometimes you'll hear this called like an outpouching. Okay, and so it's basically anything that grows in your blood vessels that's not supposed to. Okay? And so there's 2 types of aneurysms that are out there. And so there's one type called fusiform aneurysms. And those are aneurysms that kind of form, I like to think of it like they form in line with the blood vessel. Okay. And so you can see here that, this is kind of the normal shape of the blood vessel. And so the blood vessel kind of expanded out right here, okay? And so it's literally just kind of a localized expansion. So nothing new was really formed. It's just something that was there already, just kind of got a little bit bigger, okay? The other type of aneurysm that's out there is called a saccular aneurysm. And so this is something that kind of forms offline from the usual blood flow, okay? And so C and D are good examples of saccular. Okay, and so for C, you can kind of tell from the geometry that this blood vessel, used to be just kind of a straight tube like this. Okay, but the aneurysm kind of formed kind of off the side of that tube. So it's not something that's that's not something that formed in line with the blood vessel. It kind of formed literally outside of it. And each of these kind of have their own associated risks, and they're more common in certain parts of the body. All right, so what are the risks of aneurysm? Okay, so because by themselves, if you have a, if you think of I'm going to relate this to plumbing again because it's kind of most related to plumbing. If you use a pipe, that has kind of a little bit of a bulge to it, it's not going to kill you, right? It's not going to ruin your sink. It's not going to flood the building, right? And so by itself, having an enlargement from purely fluid mechanics point of view is not really a bad thing. But there are a lot of biological consequences to aneurysms that could happen. And so the first thing is rupture. And so rupture is kind of it's not as common for the fusiform ones, but they are common for the saccular ones. Okay. And so what can happen for these aneurysms is that they can actually rupture. Okay. And rupture meaning like a hole gets torn into the aneurysm walls, okay? And you start to bleed internally, profusely. And of course, that's a very bad thing. So, I know the blood's supposed to be inside your body, but it should only be in certain parts of your body. It shouldn't be, it shouldn't be in your brain. It shouldn't be in other parts. Okay. And so that's one big risk. Okay. The other big risk is thrombosis, or thrombosis is another word for coagulation as well. Okay. And so that's more of a common thing for the fusiform aneurysm. So what can happen is that, because the blood kind of has to follow in kind of an unnatural path here in the fusiform aneurysms, okay, what it can do is that it can trigger coagulation, or can trigger thrombosis. And so what can happen is that if thrombosis is triggered, then this entire vessel kind of gets blocked off, okay, because all the blood there curdles and it forms kind of a solid block. And of course that's not good too. Okay. All right. And so how do aneurysms form? Well, that's a great question. I think, we actually don't have a great answer to right now, but some people think that some hereditary factors play a big role. Okay. And so there's some inherited diseases like Marfan syndrome, which we know kind of leads to aneurysms a lot. But there are also some environmental factors that can play a role as well. So smoking, high blood pressure can also lead to aneurysms. But all of these are, I would say, except for maybe some of these hereditary conditions, these aren't, the evidence is not super convincing right now. I mean, there's correlations that are out there, but it's not, there's no, what we like to call, there's no causal relationship yet. And so there's some kind of statistical correlations, but how, like, for instance, how cigarette smoking, how that, mechanically causes aneurysms, I think is still being studied to this day. Okay. And so that's why I kind of have this note at the end. So aneurysms, even though we can see them and they're usually pretty, severe when they happen, relatively speaking, we understand very little about them. And a lot of times they're very difficult to detect too, because, a lot of times patients don't experience any symptoms. And so if the patients aren't seeing any symptoms, then, it's hard to kind of really know what's going on. All right, any questions on this? Okay, so let's talk about one class of aneurysms that are actually really, really scary. And so these are cerebral aneurysms. And so these are aneurysms that can occur in the blood vessels in your brain. Okay. And they form as little sacs like this. And the really scary thing about cerebral aneurysms, and I hate to leave you, it's class almost over. I hate to leave you with this fact because it kind of makes you, first time I learned this, it kind of kept me up at night. A lot of people actually have these aneurysms in their brain. And so, based on the data that people have, about 4 to 6% of adults aged, 30, and up have an aneurysm in the brain. Okay, that means probably one person in this room has one in their brain right now. Okay, but thankfully most of these are harmless. Okay, and so you'll have kind of an aneurysm in your brain, but you just won't know it because it doesn't do anything. Okay, but if this aneurysm happens to rupture, it leads to internal bleeding inside your brain, which often leads to death very, very quickly for people. So, some doctors have called cerebral aneurysms kind of a ticking time bomb for some people because they just don't know that it's there. And when it happens, it just happens so quickly that, even if you do survive, unfortunately, your quality of life is going to be a lot lower because it leads to a lot of permanent damage in your brain. Right? All right, question. So is it possible that aneurysms are caused by the body trying to adapt to abnormal shear stress areas in the blood vessel? That's one of the predominant theories, actually. So that's one of the leading schools of thought right now for how aneurysms form, is that it's an adaptation from your body to abnormal wall shear stress values. Yeah, that is one of the leading schools of thought, but it's one of many, and so people think of a lot of different things. Yeah. Okay. And the really scary thing about cerebral aneurysms is that they're asymptomatic, and so a lot of times you don't know that you have them until it's kind of too late, until it ruptures, right? Because in order to detect them, you have to do like a CT scan of your brain, and most people aren't going to walk into the clinic and say, "Hey, do a CT scan of my brain," right? Most of the time you have to have some kind of reason to do a CT scan up there. And so you have to have either some kind of migraines or headaches or something like that. And so a lot of these aneurysms actually get detected by mistake. And so, there's no good screening program for that right now. Okay. And most of these are saccular in variety. And so you have very little fusiform cerebral aneurysms, and their diameters can be very big. And so they can range anywhere from 1.5 millimeters, and some that are even 50 millimeters and above. And so I've seen some that are really, really big. Right? And so it's scary. Doctors literally call it the silent ticking time bomb for a lot of people, because you don't know if you have it, and if you have it, and it ruptures, it's kind of too late. So it's scary, and because of that, this is a very a lot of people are researching on this, both on the medical side and on the engineering analysis side as well. And so this is a very hot topic of research. All right, any questions on this?
Is there a reason they can't use like that same method with the pressure drug? Because it's like too instantaneous for to kind of like read.
You can definitely use that. It's just that most of the time you just never have a reason to be up there to begin with. And so if you do have a reason to like stick a catheter up there, like of course you can detect it, but it's just not a very common thing. Like you go to the doctor, for your routine checkup, there's nothing that you do in your checkup that would suggest that you have something up there. And so it's not that it's hard to measure. It's just that most people just don't get it scanned. Right?
What is the symptoms that happen? You just all of a sudden pass out?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of feel really dizzy, really dazed. It's basically the same thing as having a stroke. So yeah, it's scary. One thing I did in graduate school, actually, so because they actually did, and this is kind of now that I'm talking about it, it sounds really unethical, but they kind of made like a research challenge out of it. And so there's a research group that's studying these a lot, and they have medical scans to people that have these aneurysms. And what they did was they took 6 of them, okay, and they passed them out to a lot of different research groups. And then what they said was that, okay, here are scans of people with cerebral aneurysms. So these are people with sacs of blood in their brain. We want you to run a simulation or use whatever methods that you want to predict whether these aneurysms ruptured or not. And so we were basically running simulations to predict whether these people died or not, which is kind of a morbid thing to think about. And so, a lot of people participated because it's a very, I know quite a bit about these, because I participated in that challenge. But the interesting thing was that I think maybe 50 groups participated. And so that's, for the research community, that's huge. That's a huge amount of groups. Not a single group predicted all 6 correctly. I think the average was about 50%. And so, basically, what that was saying was that, we have all these sophisticated engineering tools, all this sophisticated analysis, and we did no better than flipping a coin. And so, that was kind of the depressing thing. The results were depressing, and the challenge itself was depressing. And so, I don't like to think about it too much, but it's kind of an interesting kind of illustration of how difficult these things are to analyze. Okay, and so let's talk about the fluid mechanics. For the last 3 minutes. Okay. So the interesting thing about the fluid mechanics is that they're not conduit vessels, and what I mean by that is that blood can't pass through. So they kind of have to, enter the sac and then kind of exit the sac from the same place. Okay, and so because of that unique geometry, what you have is a lot of recirculating flow, and so a lot of times you have kind of this constant kind of vortex of flow that's going on inside these aneurysms. Okay. And for some aneurysms, depending on where they're located, you might also have like a high velocity jet. Okay? And so you might have a jet of fluid that comes, it hits the back of the wall, and then kind of rebounds off of that. Okay. And so, like I mentioned before, for these kinds of, because the recirculation is really low, thrombosis is relatively rare, and so you're going to have very little, coagulation or blood clotting, but rupture is the main concern. Okay. And part of the reason people hypothesize that your blood vessels in your brain are especially vulnerable to this is that your cerebral blood vessels have a lot less elastin in their structure than other ones, and so that makes them more vulnerable to to aneurysms. Okay. And so there's a lot of theories and possible explanations about why aneurysms form and grow and rupture, but the short answer is that nobody really knows yet. So, there's groups on one side of the argument, there's groups on another side, and then there's groups on a third side that, like, where the heck did you come from? Like, how did you come up with that theory? And everyone just bickers, and everyone has data that kind of supports their argument, but nothing is really super convincing. Okay. And so actually, to George's point earlier, some people think that if you have a high amount of wall shear stress in your aneurysms, that's going to lead to rupture because that damages the vessel wall and that causes it to rupture. Makes sense, right? Another theory is that if you actually have a low amount of wall shear stress, then that actually causes your blood vessels to maladapt, and that causes it to to rupture that way, which is also very reasonable. Okay. And so you have one camp that thinks high wall shear stress is bad, another camp that thinks low wall shear stress is bad. They each have their own evidence to support it. They both kind of make sense, but we haven't come to an agreement yet. Okay. But what is kind of agreed upon is that, when rupture occurs, it's because the vessel wall itself has been weakened to the point where, it just kind of tears on its own. Okay. It's just how that happens, and the reason why that happens is still up for debate. All right. Any final questions on this before we wrap it up for the week? Yep.
It's kind of weird, but what does sex hormone exposure mean?
Sex hormone exposure? Oh, I think that's if you have like an injection of because like some people take like hormone therapy or stuff like that. So that's like if you have an abnormal amount of hormones in your body that shouldn't be there.
Going back on this, is this could it just be like biological instead of like it has to be
It could be, yeah. And so that's that's what people are kind of currently debating right now. So we don't know if it's biological, how much fluid mechanics plays a role into it. There's a lot of theories out there. And so the community just hasn't come to an agreement on one just yet. Part of the challenge that is it's so rare, and a lot of times when it does happen, it's hard to get data on that happening. And so in order to properly study this, you have to detect someone with an aneurysm, and you have to get a scan from them. And it has to be before an event happens. And so you have to kind of make a prediction, have an event happen, and then you kind of explain why that happened. And so it's challenging just from an experimental setup point of view.
And I guess it'd be hard to try to go data along, trying to save the life.
Exactly. Of course, yes. Yeah. All right, and so that's all we got time for this week. And so thank you everyone for tuning in. And so on Tuesday we'll finish up these lecture notes. And so I think we still have quite a bit to go. And so we'll continue with that. So remember, your vascular tutorials are due tomorrow at 11:59. And so if you have any issues with it, just let me know. So have a great weekend, everyone, and I'll see you guys next week. Yeah.
Questions on the.
What? So
For the segment, one branch overlap. And then I had an issue with getting the trying not to get the overlap.
I got it, thank you.
They
I'm gonna check that out.
you like changes the angle very weirdly, like when you do that. So we just skip that reason, otherwise it causes the.
Yeah, so for cases where the path is not changing correctly, it's really hard to get the segmentation. You have to be really conscious. Look at the heart rate. Here.
And then so, and then the distance between like the path points and the segments, is this, I know we want to like count every point, but is that just based on how accurate or reading it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
So usually I say that the path is.
So this is all.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's actually being well. It is